The next really cool tool we'll talk about is Nessus, which is a popular vulnerability scanner. Now, of course, we're talking about network scanning, not necessarily vulnerability scanning, but you'll find that the two can actually go hand in hand, and that's why I bring up Nessus during this part of the course. We're going to use it a little extensively later on. Now, Nessus is probably one of the most commonly used vulnerability scanners out there. And in fact, if you've been doing security for a number of years, then you probably learned Nmap and Nessus early on. Those are two of the most valuable tools a security person could learn early in the day. Now, previously, Nessus was command line only. As a matter of fact, it was an open source software that primarily you saw on Linux-based systems. Now it's evolved into something much more. Tenable, the company that currently owns Nessus, took it into a multi-platform commercial product. It can run on a wide variety of platforms now, including Windows. There is still a version that you can download free for home use and for limited training use. Now, Nessus has to have its vulnerability databases updated periodically, and it uses updates called plugins. And these plugins contain the most current vulnerabilities that are out there, that have been analyzed and included in the plugins for Nessus. Now, obviously, you'd want to do this a couple of times a week, at least, because plugins are released all the time. These plugins enable Nessus to perform thousands of checks on a wide variety of different operating systems, including Mac OS, Linux, Windows, Unix, and so forth. Now, you can scan entire subnets with Nessus or just one individual host if you like. You can even go in and disable or enable different checks depending upon what different operating systems you know are on the network. For example, if you know there's no AIX hosts out there, then you could go in and disable all the AIX checks because you don't want to waste time checking something that you know is not out there. Now, when it runs the scan, it also displays vulnerabilities that are listed on the host, and it'll display these by the host's IP address and the severity of the vulnerability. And these could be high, medium, and low type of vulnerabilities, red, orange, and green, if you will. It'll also show you informational types of vulnerabilities or just different configuration details about the system that it scans, things that aren't necessarily vulnerable, but you may want to keep your eye on. So what I want to do now is just show you a little bit about Nessus, and in the next segment, we'll go ahead and run a Nessus scan. Okay, let's take a look at Nessus. Now, Nessus runs on the local host on a particular port. By default, it's 8834. Although that can be changed. Now, you'll access Nessus using a web browser, and you'll have to provide credentials to get into the system. And these don't have to be the same credentials that you use to access your computer. So you see different tabs up here, and I want to show you a few of these. Users is where you can add another authorized user to Nessus, and you can give them different permissions. I already have one user in here, that's myself. You also have configuration, and configuration gives you different settings for Nessus and dictates how it will run some of the scans. For example, you have general settings here, you have feed settings, you have mobile settings, results settings, and advanced settings. Let's go a few of these. General settings look at things like the SMTP server web proxy you may have to use, and you may have to put different hosts, ports, from sender email and so forth. And this basically allows you to email the results of Nessus to yourself. You also have feed settings, and the feed requires an activation code, and the feed is basically the Nessus plugins. So you can get an activation code from Tenable for the home feed or for the professional feed. Obviously, that's what you pay for. Mobile settings enable you to sync with an active sync server, an Apple Profile Manager, or good for enterprise. The results settings dictate how you can add rules to disable plugins or change their severity. So you can add a new plugin rule here. You can also look at advanced settings. And advanced settings, unless you really know what you're doing, I wouldn't mess with these too much. But you may occasionally have to change them depending upon the environment you're scanning in. The policies is really one thing you need to look at. Now, the policies basically let you alter the pre-built policies that are there, or go ahead and add a new type of scan policy. And with this, you can add credentials to the scan, because sometimes you need to scan Windows and Linux with credentials for the machine, because otherwise you may not get enough information out of them as a non-credentialed user. Now, obviously, if you're doing an internal penetration test, you might have these credentials. But if you're scanning from the outside, or it's a black box type of test, you won't have these. Here the different plugins are listed, and you can actually enable or disable them, and you can update them as you need to. For example, if you knew there was no AIX boxes on the network, you could disable all these plugins, and there's 11,024 of them, so that would actually save you some time if you didn't run those. The scan templates that are available to you, basically you would use to construct a new scan and use that scan as a template. So you would click that, and you would name the Nessus scan. You would determine whether you want to run it now or use a template or schedule it. And then you would go with the different policies that you've created or use the default policies. And we looked at default policies a few moments ago. So once you would create this, you would run this scan, and you can save this as a template to run later. And obviously the scan queue is where you would actually start a new scan. And you could base that upon a template you just created or base it upon an existing policy. In our next session, I'm going to show you how to actually run a scan, and we'll scan the network of virtual machines we have on this box.